Hello everyone, and welcome to the first of Friday's videos. There's only one video for this Friday, so I'm sure you're very relieved. When you come to class for the 1 hour of English 5 on Friday, we're going to focus on the English language. There's still a couple of concepts that we need to go over so that you're very well prepared to be in the classroom. Particularly, we're going to look at multiple word verbs, prepositions, and spoken English. We're going to talk about what this is, all of these concepts, and how you can teach them in class. The first couple of weeks we're going to be talking about multiple word verbs, and when we're all done here, and you can probably assume that there'll be an exam question related to this concept. When we're all done here, you need to be able to answer the question, are multiple word verbs a grammar topic or a lexical topic? Depending on your choice and your reasonings, would then determine how you teach them in class. So keep that in mind as we're going through these sets of videos on multiple word verbs. Before we jump into the first category of multiple word verbs, let's just review some key points about verbs. We're going to take a look at 4 key points that are related to the grammar associated with verbs. There might be 1 or 2 concepts that are fairly new to you. For that, I do apologize, but you do need to know them. And these 4 points are the 4 points that I use when I think about the grammar of verbs. The first, if you look at this little cartoon, which is based on a very famous saying, I tweet, therefore I am. There's 2 verbs in here, tweet and am, to tweet and to be. And they show you the 2 basic categories of verbs. Action verbs, to tweet, and state of being verbs, to be. So basically we can divide verbs into 2 categories. We tend to say that the action verbs are referred to as lexical verbs because they have a meaning, a vocabulary-based meaning, where the state of being verbs we often refer to as copular verbs. And I'm sure you've learned what copular verbs are. They can only be followed by predicate noun or predicate adjective. Maybe they're followed by an adverb or a prepositional phrase. You also know that verbs can show various things in English. They can show tense, aspect, and mood. Tense, of course, refers to the concept of present or past. Let me say that again. Tense refers to the concepts of present or past, or in this chart, past and non-past, which is very a linguistic approach. A future is not a tense because linguistically, tense is defined as something that has an inflected ending. So for example, in the present tense, we add s to the third person singular. That's an inflected ending. In the past tense, in the regular form, add ed to the ending. So therefore, it's inflected as well. You do the same thing in Dutch in some cases with the addition of the t in the present tense and the addition of the de or te or den or ten in the past tense. So tense is only something that has an inflected ending. Future, on the other hand, is a modal. It's it's often with the modal will or the semi-modals to be going to. There's also the other modals, of course, like should, could, can. Those are referred to as the concept of modality, and they add a sense of meaning there, ability, obligation, things like that. Aspect refers to what we call the perfect. The addition of the auxiliary verb to have plus the en or the past participle, and the progressive, also known as the continuous, which uses the auxiliary verb to be with the present participle or the ing ending. We also have what's referred to as voice, active voice. The dirk opens the mail. The mail is open. I'm sorry. The clerk opens the mail. The mail is opened by the clerk. Is the passive voice. In the passive voice, the object in the original active voice now becomes the subject, and the subject in the original active voice becomes the by agent, by the clerk. Okay, I know that you studied the passive extensively last year, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that. But you need to understand the concept. I'm always going to refer to tense as present or perfect. I'm sorry. I'm going to refer to tense as present or past. Aspect is perfect or progressive or continuous. Voice is active or passive. And then, of course, the concept of modality as well, which adds a sense of mood to the sentence. We also know that verbs can be transitive or intransitive. If a verb is transitive, it takes an object. Raise your hands. You raise your hands is the subject there. So the hands are raising. Rise early with the lark is an intransitive use of the same verb, and in this case, it does not take an object. It's usually followed with an adverb, early, and or a prepositional phrase, with the lark. There's a special category of intransitive verbs, which are called ergative verbs, and these are verbs in which the subject receives the action. So the window shattered. In this case, the window is doing the shattering. The ship sank. The ship is doing the sinking. He fainted. He is doing the fainting. This is important because this becomes a special class of phrasal verbs, which we're going to talk about in this video. Sometimes you can change these and give them a passive meaning if they have a transitive counterpart. The window suddenly shattered. But I could say the burglar shattered the window. So there's a transitive counterpart to that. So therefore I can put it in the passive. The window was shattered by the burglar. Okay. The ship sank. That's ergative. While the submarine sank, the ship is transitive. So therefore the ship was sunk by the submarine is the passive formation. After the party he fainted. But there is no transitive counterpart there. Okay, fainting is an action that only the subject can do. So therefore it's a special type of intransitive verb, and therefore it has no passive formation. You could never say he is fainted or he was fainted. That you never ever say those types of things. The fourth category is the concept of static and dynamic, which goes back to the concept of copular too, because copular verbs fall under static. And the idea here is that static verbs usually only occur in the present or in the past tense. They usually do not occur in the continuous aspect. So you would never say, I am hearing a thunder. That is what prescriptive grammarians say. Descriptive grammarians, like myself, we now understand that some static verbs can be used colloquially in the continuous. The biggest and best example is McDonald's, I'm loving it. It's a very common phrase. People use it all the time. You know, we use it ourselves. I'm loving this piece of cake right now, or I'm loving my English class because it's so exciting. It's used in spoken English. It's used in a very colloquial sense. Dynamic verbs can go into all the tenses, all the aspects, all the moods, and all the voices. All right, so those are some 4 key points. So now let's talk about the first set of multiple word verbs, which are called phrasal verbs. I'm sure you've run into these before. Phrasal verbs are things like shake it off. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. You know, Taylor Swift has made "shake it off" a household term lately. You know, you even have frat boys shaking it off, and of course you have dancing dads and darling daughters shaking it off too. Thank you, Taylor Swift, for giving us another thing to do and look at on Facebook, all the different shake it off videos. But what exactly is this thing we call a phrasal verb? Well, if we take a look at shake it off is made up of two parts. Shake plus off. Shake, of course, is the verb. Off, if you look at it, it looks like an adverb. And in other situations, it would be an adverb. But in this case, when you're talking phrasal verbs, we don't call it an adverb or a preposition. We call it a particle. And we're doing this, we're making this distinction here so as not to confuse ourselves or students with the fact that this is an adverb or this is a preposition. In this case, it's not functioning like an adverb. It's not functioning like a preposition. It's the combination of the two together that gives this meaning. So you can't call it an adverb. You can't call it a preposition. So we're going to call it, as most linguists do, we're going to call it a particle. And of course, meaning is not determined by its elements. This one's close. But to shake something off means to get rid of something. I mean, to shake means to move your legs or your arms wildly. It's not necessarily the same meaning. So this is what makes phrasal verbs most difficult for your students, is learning the various meanings for them. And in English, we use a lot of phrasal verbs. So we're going to take a look at two basic categories: transitive phrasal verbs and intransitive phrasal verbs. We're going to start with the intransitive phrasal verbs. And there's two categories here: the pure intransitive phrasal verbs and the ergative phrasal verbs. So we're going to start with the pure. A pure intransitive phrasal verb means that they do not take an object, which is the definition of intransitive, and that the verb and the particle must stay together. Because they don't take an object, there's no reason to separate them. You would never put the adverb or the prepositional phrase between the particle and the verb. That's just too confusing. So you get something like the plane took off, or she sat down. And again, you would never ever, if it's followed by an adverb, you would never ever put the adverb before the particle. It always comes after. The plane took off quickly. She sat down slowly. Okay. Sometimes they're found, they come with prepositional phrases, which can be very confusing because sometimes students will confuse a phrasal verb with a prepositional phrase as a phrasal prepositional verb, which we're going to take a look at in the next week's video. So you have to know the difference so you can help your student. He checked out of the hotel. Checked out is the phrasal verb. Of the hotel is the prepositional phrase. There is no combination he checked out of. Sometimes you see this in course books and it's wrong. So it's important that you know the difference. Okay, so you have to keep in mind that pure intransitive phrasal verbs can be followed by prepositional phrases, and we cannot confuse those with phrasal prepositional verbs. Okay, we said that the second category was the ergative phrasal verbs. So let's just take a look at those. Remember, when something is an ergative verb, it means that the subject is receiving the action. The window shattered. The ship sank. He fainted. The same concept applies here, except now we're using a phrasal verb. So we're using a verb plus a particle. So some things to keep in mind. They describe an action that is experienced by the subject, and the verb and the particle, like the other intransitive phrasal verbs, are not separated. The storm began to die down. Okay, so in this case, the dying down is being done by the storm. There's no object to do it. There's nothing that can really come after that. That sentence is very complete there. They can have a transitive counterpart, and where the verb and the particle can be separated. This is where, of course, it gets messy. The ship blew up. Okay, that's an example of an ergative phrasal verb, but it does have a transitive counterpart, and we can say that the terrorists blew the ship up. Okay, so just like we can have passive formations of ergative verbs with a transitive counterpart, we can have separable verbs here if the ergative verb has a transitive counterpart. So keep that in mind. So it's the meaning changes slightly here. Who's doing the work changes. The ship is being blown up in both cases, but how we write it is a bit different. Okay. So now we've looked at these two categories. We're going to now look at our transitive phrasal verbs. And in our transitive phrasal verbs, we're really going to talk about two things. We're going to talk about the categories of the transitive phrasal verbs and the concept of particle movement. So first we're going to start with the categories. The first are what referred to, and this is the biggest category of transitive phrasal verbs, are the separable transitive phrasal verbs. And just as the name implies, the direct object may come between the verb and the particle. This is what makes them confusing then for students. They don't see that the particle goes with the verb, and they confuse the meaning. The best analogy I can give you is your verbs that are separable, where the particle comes usually at the end of the sentence. Aankomen for arrive. Ik kom aan. Sometimes non-Dutch speakers like myself, we forget to look for those particles, and then we misunderstand the meaning of the sentence. So, hij komt naar school aan. Is different. It means something different. I mean, if I don't see that particle at the end, I might say he comes to school, when really the better translation is he arrives at school. There's a difference in terms of the concept of the action, and that's what happens with students here. So you have to be aware of what these are so you can help them, because if we look at the second sentence, Maggie looked up the address. Well, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But if we say Maggie looked the address up, yeah, they may confuse the meaning. They may not see the up, they may not pay attention. It's a small word, it's at the end of the sentence. They may lose sight of it. So you have to help them see this. This type of phrasal verb is very, very common in conversation, fiction, and news writing, but you don't find it that often in academic writing. So these are tend to be very colloquial. We use them a lot in spoken language, so that's very, very important. So one thing you should keep in mind is that teaching some of these phrasal verbs should show up in the students' conversation, but not necessarily in the writing, because almost every phrasal verb that we have in English has a more academic one verb replacement or synonym for it. So they need to start to learn what these are so that they can then switch them up when they need to. All right, let's take a look at a second category. The second category are called the inseparable transitive phrasal verbs. And again, I think by now you guys can figure out what all this means. In this case, this is a small subclass. They take an object that makes them transitive, of course, but the verb and the particle cannot be separated. Because the bigger class is the separable transitive phrasal verbs, this class and the next one we're going to take a look at, these are ones that need to really be memorized by the student when they come across them. They need to really know that they can't be separated, because they'll get into the habit of separating, and then all of a sudden they can't separate a couple. So they really need to learn things like pick on or look after. These aren't phrasal verbs that cannot be separated. Don't pick on my brother. You would never say, don't pick my brother on. I think you can hear that that sounds terrible. Look after my sister, will you? Look my sister after, will you? No, doesn't work. So usually they can maybe, as they develop their English ear, they can maybe hear some of these differences, but you certainly should hear the differences. And the third type, the last type, here we go, moving along the path, is referred to as the permanently separated phrasal verbs. These are transitive phrasal verbs where the verb and the particle always are separated. This too is a very small subclass, and it always requires the direct object to come between. So again, this is something that has to be memorized by your student. That job is getting Janice down. The judge let the thief off with a light sentence. You would never ever put these together. The judge let off the thief. We never say that in English. It may sound okay to an immature ear, but it's not correct. So these two students are going to have to learn them by heart. Okay. Now we've got to talk about this concept of particle movement. We've seen that in some cases the particle can come next to with transitive phrasal verbs or can come after the object. This whole concept is really called particle movement, and it's a concept. And the thing is, it's pretty easy since most transitive phrasal verbs are separable, but there are a couple rules that you need to keep in mind. First, most transitive phrasal verbs take the particle movement rule. You have seen this. The movement of the particle is optional. Maggie looked up the address. Maggie looked the address up. There's one exception to this, and that is whenever you're using a personal pronoun or a demonstrative pronoun. These have to come between the verb and the particle. So if you replace the address with it, Maggie looked it up, it has to come between the verb and the particle. The same with the demonstrative pronouns, that, this, these, those. Joe made these up. You can never say Joe made up these. It doesn't work in English. There's one other case. Normally what happens here is if there's a very long noun phrase that makes up the direct object, native speakers will move the particle next to the verb. So John looked up some information about an early religion in which forces of nature such as fire, that's all that part of the direct object, were worshipped. You can say John looked some information about an early religion in which forces of nature such as fire up were worshipped. You could do that. It just sounds weird because it's such a long distance between the verb and the particle. It just doesn't seem natural to us native speakers. So even though the second thing I just said is grammatically correct, it's not something we would normally say. This is something you would do mostly in academic writing. Okay. So that is a brief overview of phrasal verbs, and we're going to be working with phrasal verbs for the remainder of the semester. Okay, so make sure that you've followed the study guide, you answer those questions, you've done the pre-assessment, now go do the post-assessment, and then I'll see you in class on Friday, and we'll start with some how do we teach these types of things in class. All right, thank you very much, guys. See you Friday.